Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
Hi, everyone. It's Kalila Brown-Dean, host of Disrupted. Back in late August, a shooter at a Minneapolis church killed 2 young school children. Young people whose lives were full of light and promise. Many others were injured, and even those who weren't physically harmed will have their lives permanently changed by this tragedy. And just hours before I recorded this segment, conservative activist Charlie Kirk was shot and killed on a Utah college campus while debating politics. As we reflect on these events, we're listening back to our episode on mass shootings with psychiatrist Jonathan Metzl. Our convo was recorded in 2024, so you'll hear references to shootings that happened in that year. We hope that you'll take this time to listen, to think about the lives that are lost, and to commit to moving forward together. Thanks for listening. In 2018, a white gunman opened fire at a Waffle House in Nashville. It was filled with people of color.
4 people are dead and 4 others wounded after a gunman opens fire at a Waffle House restaurant overnight.
3 of the victims died at the scene and 1 died at a hospital. Police say a customer in the restaurant was able to wrestle the AR-15 away from the gunman.
Nashville police are confirming that shooter was wielding an assault-type rifle when he opened fire around 3:30 this morning.
4 people were killed and multiple others were injured. The shooting became the basis of the book, What We've Become, Living and Dying in a Country of Arms. In it, psychiatrist and gun violence expert Dr. Jonathan Metzl examines the Nashville shooting to understand the complexities surrounding guns in the U.S. For years, Metzl thought about gun violence as a public health issue. His approach treated it like an epidemic and treated guns as a health risk. But as he studied the Nashville shooting, Metzl realized he'd been missing something crucial for years: the cultural power of guns. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Today we're talking with Metzl about the politics of gun policy. Dr. Jonathan Metzl is Frederick B. Rentschler II Professor of Sociology and Psychiatry and Director of the Department of Medicine, Health and Society at Vanderbilt University. Professor, it's wonderful to have you on Disrupted.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
You talk in your work about taking a public health approach to gun violence. Share with our listeners what that approach is and why you think it's important to view this as a public health challenge.
Well, I've had a pretty interesting, for me, career arc about that. I spent maybe 15 years as the number one proponent of the public health approach to gun violence. I started off because I wrote a book about why Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers were not seen as patriots when they tried to arm themselves in the 60s, and how society really viewed white gun owners as patriots and black gun owners as criminals or threats or gangsters, something like that. And so I spent a lot of my career saying we need equal access, equal laws. We need to think about community safety. But I will say, just as a hook, that my last book actually critiques the public health model. And so I thought that I was writing a book about a mass shooting where I was going to become even more of an advocate for public health. But what I find in my new book, What We've Become, is really the limitations of public health as a framework. And so I guess in sum, I feel like I'm on all sides of this. I want public health, but I've also become acutely aware of the limitations of that approach.
What do you see as one of the major limitations, and how your work helps us rethink or reframe that approach?
So my new book, What We've Become, tells the story of the Nashville Waffle House mass shooting in 2018. And really in that story, it's a really shocking and as so many are, horrific mass shooting. In this mass shooting, a naked white man with an AR-15 bursts into a Waffle House in Nashville in 2018. It's 2:00 in the morning, and that Waffle House is full of young adults of color who are out celebrating after the clubs close. This naked white male mass shooter kills 4 incredible young adults, a rapper, a basketball star, a social worker, a cook, an Instagram model, and horrifically injures many more. And then I really start to unpack the story of how this man, this AR-15, get to the scene of the crime. I track the body, the white body, and the gun through a course from Illinois, rural conservative Illinois, where he starts to Nashville. And what I say is that before he becomes a mass shooter, he was a white man with a gun. And he walked through all of these spaces basically advertising that he was going to commit a mass shooting. He was stopped by police 5 times. He was stopped by the FBI when he tried to burst into the White House grounds. He was basically advertising, here's what I'm going to do. But because he was seen as a white body who had every right to carry a gun, there was nothing society could do about it. But also the laws of open carry didn't, he was seen as a patriot. And so part of the story I tell in the book is public health is a frame that looks at injuries and deaths, but we don't tell that story of before a white body pulls the trigger. That's really the story of this book, that open carry to me is as big a threat, not just to health, but to democracy, to civic society, as are the injury and death numbers that we're so conversant in.
What was it about this shooting at this Waffle House that compelled you to write about it and to tell these stories of not just the shooter, but also to affirm the dignity of the victims?
Mass shootings happen more than one a day now. It's horrific, but we've habituated it. We've deeply habituated multiple victim gun homicide, which we didn't do 20 years ago. I mean, when Columbine happened, even when Sandy Hook happened, we stopped as a country and we said, this is not us. And now you and I are speaking a week and a half after a 13-year-old committed a mass shooting in a school in Georgia. And even something like that, as horrible as it is, it stays in the news cycle for about 3 or 4 days. And so part of what I aim to do in this book is to slow that down and say, what happens if we stop the clock and tell the real before and after of one mass shooting? What do we learn that we don't think we knew about guns, about race, about safety? It was a very surprising experience because I started the project thinking I knew the answers, and by the end of the book, I have many more questions than answers.
Academia conditions, socializes us to be detached, right? This idea that in order to be objective, you can't really care about the topic that you're writing about. And that, to me, always felt so disingenuous, because what you're talking about are people. You're talking about power. You're talking about the ways that we navigate community and space, and how sometimes that goes overlooked, and in other ways it feels intentional to create that. How do you, as a scholar, given your background, how do you think about your role in telling these stories, but also thinking about the ways you are challenging your reader to not just read it and say, oh, that's unfortunate, but to really think about action and next steps? How does that show up for you?
This was an emotionally wrenching book to write, and also felt like an important book to write, exactly for the reasons you suggest. I felt on a mission to tell the stories of the victims and the remarkable families and the resilience. We're here in Nashville. The mother of one of the victims is now running for state office. Many other mothers who lost children in mass shootings are entering the political sphere. And so part of the story here is I felt it was so important to narrate the resilience of what it means to live on. And it wasn't, to say it wasn't easy is an understatement. I mean, there's a chapter in the middle of the book called 42 Seconds that is in the room of the actual mass shooting. And I tell the second by second breakdown of what it feels like to be in the room of a mass shooting. And I had to go stay in an Airbnb for 3.5 weeks by myself to write that chapter. It was so emotionally difficult. I actually couldn't interact with anybody. I just kind of sat with it. And I'll admit, like, I cried multiple times writing that chapter and many other parts of it. But this particular, I wasn't a psychiatrist, neutral. I was somebody who was feeling the horrific nature of what bullets do to bodies, of what shootings do to communities. I really wanted that emotion to come through. And I will say, you never know when you write a book about a topic like this. There's been certainly a lot of blowback, a lot of controversy, but I've gone on a lot of very conservative, pro-gun rights outlets, and they resonated with that chapter also. The power of an AR-15 bullet entering a body and the cavitation it causes and what that means and what that does. So I ended up, that chapter kind of took me to unexpected places and unexpected conversations. And so it felt like in some small way, personally, that process of writing that chapter was worth it. And I would urge more scholars who write on topics like this to kind of feel the emotion of the tragedy of humanity that this topic represents.
I want to first name how much I appreciate you for being vulnerable to go to those spaces, to do that work. Because I think often for victims of gun violence or their families, the people who are left behind, they do feel forgotten. They do feel like that tragic loss of their loved one, the very violent loss of their loved one, becomes a blip in the conversation, and people move on and not think about what that means. And so not just for the families of those victims, but for those who are maybe first responders and have to see that, or those who are working in the Waffle House and thinking about, how do I go back to a place that has been so tragic? You also talk about some of the forces that are creating this environment where these policy choices are happening and who's influencing those choices that can then override the voices and experiences of those closest to the challenge. You talk in particular about the NRA and say that the NRA is very different from how we think about other lobbyists. For example, how the pro-tobacco industry has leveraged its influence. What is it that makes the NRA so unique and also so influential in this space?
The NRA really is using guns as a Trojan horse toward a much broader sphere of influence. And so the book begins and ends in courtrooms and shows the effect of NRA politicians who put in place NRA judges who then instill a host of incredibly anti-democratic rulings, overturning the will of voters. The book actually ends in the Supreme Court case that overturns New York's gun laws and shows how, while we were arguing importantly about injuries and deaths, the NRA was really using this issue to mobilize a much bigger, I just openly say it, anti-democratic agenda that overturned the will of voters, but also has broad implications for voting rights and women's reproductive choice and all of these other things. And so in a way, it wasn't just about guns. That's one of my critiques of the public health model, is it sees the literal, which is important, obviously, but it doesn't see the bigger power grab that was happening. It has relatively less to say about that. So I think that's point number one. Point number two is that it really effectively shaped what it means to own a gun, what it means to carry a gun. And I don't think our side, I think we were too lax about that for a long time. And so again, I'm a doctor. I want there to be no gun injuries and deaths. There are about 55,000 gun deaths a year in this country. That's 55,000 too many, but there are like 200 million gun owners. I mean, we have more guns than people. And so while my side is talking about the injuries and deaths, the NRA is saying, here's what it means to own and carry a gun. And their they're talking about culture and open carry and race and resentment and tribalism and all these things. And so that's another one of my critical engagements with public health, is that we just didn't pay enough attention to the meaning of what it meant to own and carry a gun. And I think that's part of it. And then I guess the third point is, in line with your question, there's a standard thing that public health does. When we see a man-made cause of death for cigarettes and asbestos insulation and cars without seatbelts, first we create a big data set, a series of evidence that shows that this product is injuring or killing people. And then we create a series of policies that governments can do to make things safer. Then we work with governments to mandate those policies. And then we bring the industry to its knees by class action suits, by showing liability. If your car is unsafe, you should be sued. If your tobacco product is causing secondhand smoke, you should be sued. And that was very effective with cigarettes, for example. If you go anywhere in the country and you light up a cigarette in the middle of a restaurant, everybody will tell you, hey, dude, secondhand smoke. And if you get into your friend's car and don't put on your seatbelt, everybody is like, no, I'm not driving until you put your seatbelt on. But we didn't have that effect with guns. And it's because the NRA knew something that public health didn't, which is that guns are not cigarettes and they're not cars. Guns have a couple centuries of history of being trappings of white power, of the right to carry a gun in public is tied to race and masculinity and whiteness. And in a way, the idea that is going to be regulated by governments, or that we're all going to kind of be on the same side for public health, that just didn't fly with guns the way it did with cigarettes. And the other important part of that is that gun manufacturers have liability protection. And so the NRA just saw a loophole in the whole thing that the public health side, my side, didn't until it was too late.
Coming up, more with Dr. Jonathan Metzl. He'll talk about how his students' relationships to guns have changed in ways he didn't expect.
Initially, 10 years ago, students were horrified. They all wanted common sense gun reform. They all wanted gun laws. They sounded like me in a way, because I can remember a time when we didn't have this.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're looking at the cultural power of guns in the U.S. with psychiatrist Jonathan Metzl. Our conversation was recorded in 2024, so please keep that in mind as Dr. Metzl discusses recent shootings. Metzl's latest book is What We've Become: Living and Dying in a Country of Arms. In the book, Metzl tackles the role of the National Rifle Association in U.S. gun culture. It's also known as the NRA. The NRA has long been a major force in Washington lobbying against gun reform. But in recent years, some believe that it's starting to lose its power. But even if one organization goes away, I don't think that means that the way people value guns will also go away. Ask Dr. Metzl if I'm thinking about this in the right way.
The demise of the NRA will happen when its job is completely done, but it doesn't see that quite yet. And so whether or not we call it the NRA or the gun industry or the gun lobby, they're part of a much bigger agenda, which is, as we were talking about before, an incredibly anti-democratic agenda. New York's gun laws had been on the books for over 100 years until the Supreme Court overturned them in the Bruin decision. There are cases across the country in blue states and cities, Oregon, Virginia, other places, where policies that were put in place by voters for gun safety are at risk because of that decision and others. And so in a way, the implications are so deep, and it has to do not just with selling guns. That's the literal, concrete misinterpretation, I argue, of what's happening here. The much bigger story is how this is tied to a much larger agenda. We see that in the U.S. We've got 35-year-old lifetime appointed judges in appellate courts and different courts across the land who are put in place because of their stance on this position. And so we're going to be living with this effect for a very long time. And also, I've written about this, not in the book, but other places. It's also a global agenda. And so using guns to destabilize democratic norms is being used by the Netanyahu government in Israel, by governments in Brazil, by rightists in Australia, other places. And so it's again, I can't say enough. I'm a doctor. I don't want there to be injuries and deaths. But injuries and deaths are a symptom of a much larger problem and agenda.
It feels like it is a form of American exceptionalism that we are exporting to other parts of the world. You talked, Jonathan, about how difficult it was to write this book overall, and some pieces of it were even more difficult. I will admit that this was a very difficult book to read. There were a couple of times where I had to put it down and come back to it because it was connecting to memories or experiences. And one of the experiences that the book connected me to was back in 2007 with the massacre at Virginia Tech. My sister was a freshman at Virginia Tech when that massacre happened. I remember getting a call from my mother, frantic, because we couldn't get through to my sister. And her dorm was right on that drill field at Virginia Tech. So she spent 3 hours under a desk, terrified. And it was before we had mass campus alert system. So all of that uncertainty. You talk about the Columbine shooting in 1999, the Virginia Tech massacre in 2007, as marking the beginning of this era of mass shooting. Why do you think mass shootings became so common and now so pervasive that we don't even talk about them in the same way? What was it about that time?
Well, part of it, and let me just say first that the question of this being a hard book is kind of what I was going for. Who habituates mass death? Civilians should not have to. Habituation of mass death happens in warfare. Traumatized people happen in warfare. My buddy got killed, but I've got to fight the battle the next day. And so I was trying to unhabituate us in this book. And so part of the time that the books are hard, I was consciously trying to evoke have people ask when they read it, what does it mean that we've habituated this, and what are the stakes of that, right? In other words, it's a feeling of helplessness and detachment and resignation. And I want us to fight back against that. And so first, thank you for saying that, even if it's a harder book to read than maybe some of my other books. But that was kind of by design. Now, I will say that there were a lot of things happening in the early 2000s having to do with race and masculinity and gun laws and the advent, just the ready accessibility of certain kinds of guns. And so it was kind of a perfect storm of a Supreme Court case, the Heller decision, that made it a lot easier for people to get guns, and a profound copycat phenomenon that was starting to happen in media, that mass shootings became a particular form of masculine grievance in a way that was almost in conversation with each other. If you look also at like the California school mass shooting, at Loma Vista, I think, or and other shootings at the time. Like the shooters were almost trying to outdo each other, but we just had many more guns around, and it was just a lot easier also for people to get guns. The assault weapons ban that was part of the '94 crime bill had lapsed, and so it was kind of a perfect storm at this one particular time that set us on the path of a real performativity of mass shootings in a way that I don't know. Having studied this for so long, every year I think, man, we hit bottom. And what I realized in writing the book was I looked at other societies that realized that they had hit bottom. Australia had a mass shooting. It had a gun culture. It wasn't like there was any one policy that Australia did. It did a bunch of stuff that probably wouldn't work here. But what Australia did is it locked everybody in a room around a table, and it said, our political system is going to compromise. Everybody's going to compromise, and we're going to come to an answer here. New Zealand had a political system that compromised. And so part of what we see in the inability to address mass shootings is also a bigger breakdown of our political system to compromise in matters of public safety. It became much more of a winner-take-all, zero-sum political system, where the kind of middle ground that other societies have done just became absent in our discourse.
I always wonder about the generational consequences of this, the ways that it has become normal for students and young people to expect that these things will happen. People often talk about the fact that students don't just do fire drills, they're doing active shooter or active safety drills now, and the ways that becomes normalized, the ways in which we think about young people as shooters or as potential people causing this kind of harm. How do you think about that in your work, about the generational consequences of our failure to at least come to the consensus to say there is a problem, even if we can't figure out how to address the problem, our inability or unwillingness to at least call a thing a thing? What are the generational consequences of that?
I teach a class at Vanderbilt called Guns in America, and I've been doing kind of gun pedagogy here for a long time, like many people have at different schools. But it's interesting because when I started doing this kind of teaching, and I would poll my students, and my co-instructor and I get all this data from our students. We use the Pew opinion poll questions. And initially, 10 years ago, students were horrified. They all wanted common sense gun reform. They all wanted gun laws. They sounded like me in a way, because I can remember a time when we didn't have this. And increasingly, half my students now they sound almost like libertarians. They say, I don't think there's a government role. I want a gun. They're targets of advertising for gun, what's called campus carry. So a lot of schools now permit students to carry guns, and they're targeted by gun ads that say you shouldn't go unarmed to that fraternity party. Women are targeted by saying you should have this particular holster hiding this particular gun in case somebody tries to roofie you at a party. Guys are like, you could be the victim of a shooting, and we've had 2 shooting events on our campus this month, actually. And for me, what's hard about that is I have tons of data that show the safety of college campuses as gun-free zones for decades. People 18 to 25 are exponentially safer on college campuses than they are 3 blocks off of campus, because 18 to 25 is a high-risk group for different kinds of gun violence. But if you're on a campus where there are no guns, there's a safety measure. But as guns now infiltrate into college campuses, college students feel like the police or somebody else isn't going to protect me, and now I want to be armed. And so the tragedy is in part about the victims of this era, but it's also the creep of the logic of I need a gun because I'm not safe without it, which was something I did not expect when I started doing this. And now I can kind of see it through their eyes, which is they've had lockdowns. I mean, we've had 2 lockdowns in the last 4 weeks. And so that feeling of helplessness is really powerful for them.
I'm struck that the semester just started, right? You're only
Yeah.
3-4 weeks into a semester and have already had 2 incidents. And I think it speaks to, again, the ways that this has become normal pattern and practice. And then when you think about the commercial aspect of people being able to profit from fear, and it links again to the erosion of those institutional protections that we have. Something else that I want to ask you about in this, often when these events happen, we are struggling to make sense of it. I often hear people say, this shouldn't happen here. You know, we experienced that in Connecticut back in 2012 with the Sandy Hook shooting, where people would say, this shouldn't happen here. And for many, it was, well, this shouldn't happen anywhere. But in that trying to make sense of it, people often assume that there must be a mental health issue at play. Like, why would a person walk into a Waffle House and cause this harm? Why would a student walk into a school and do this? Given your background in psychiatry, what do you make of that connection that people try to proffer, that in these mass shooting events, there must be a mental health illness at play?
Well, I think mental health functions in a couple of important ways that are kind of vital to acknowledge before unpacking that. I think, first of all, it's true that of these high-profile mass shootings, many do suffer or have suffered from some psychiatric symptom, either at the time of the shooting or before. And another is, I think you're right. There's a lingua franca that we live in the sane world that is governed by rules, and only a crazy person would walk into a movie theater or a school or a workplace and do something like this. And so it's a human reaction to say a crazy person that's madness. And so I deeply understand that. But I specifically for this book chose a story of a psychotic shooter to unpack that narrative. And what I show is that if you really start to tell the story of mass shootings, there are so many other factors that play a part in a mass shooting that have nothing to do with mental illness, but that we efface by saying it's all about the brain, which is kind of what the right and the NRA and media wants to do sometimes. And so I say, look at what we're not looking at when we blame mental illness. Look at all these other factors. One is substance use. People who are drinking and there's a fight and there's a gun around are much more likely to fire a weapon in anger. And that's important because in Tennessee and other places, we can carry loaded guns into bars. And so that would be a good prevention model. Past history of violence has really nothing to do with mental illness diagnosis. But people who have been violent in the past are much more likely to be violent in the future. And that's important because, for example, of histories of domestic violence, wouldn't you want to limit access to firearms for people who have those histories? But you can't do that in my state of Tennessee and other places. Shootings happen within social networks very often. Shootings happen when it's easier to get guns. I talk about in the book that race is a really interesting risk factor, again, having nothing to do with mental illness, because in the story I tell, the shooter had 5 police contacts and an FBI contact, and every time he got his guns back. And I just tell the story along the way that if this was a black man, he would have had 1 police contact, and either he would have been dead or incarcerated. And so this system enables particular bodies to get second chances and carry guns in ways that help explain this particular narrative. And I could go on and on. I just think that in a way, I just list all the other factors. And again, not to say that mental illness isn't important, but there's nothing really causal about mental illness. Mental illness doesn't cause anybody. Otherwise, everybody with mental illness would be attacking somebody or something. It doesn't work that way. And so in a way, I'm sympathetic and empathetic. I understand why that story is important, but I also want us to think much more deeply about what's left on the cutting room floor when we just say that that's what caused it.
Coming up, more with gun violence expert Dr. Jonathan Metzl. He'll share how he's able to talk to people whose viewpoints may differ from his own.
I'm always surprised that if I go in with curiosity, how much those kind of assumptions that I have break down.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're listening back to our conversation about the politics of guns in the U.S. with psychiatrist Jonathan Metzl. He's author of What We've Become, Living and Dying in a Country of Arms. Back in 2024, then presidential candidate Donald Trump faced 2 assassination attempts. Both ignited conversations about gun reform. But the needle on gun control didn't move. When I talked to Dr. Metzl that year, I asked him what he made of the political moment we were in and how those assassination attempts were shaping conversations and potential action around gun policy.
What's interesting about these 2 Trump gun episodes is that they also both happened in places where it's pretty easy for white men to carry guns in public without repercussion in a way. And so part of what's hard in What We've Become, I tell a story of a white guy who was carrying 4 semi-automatic weapons and basically telling the world that he was going to become a mass shooter. But because gun laws were so permissive, there was really nothing that anybody could do because he wasn't guilty of anything until the minute he pulled the trigger. In fact, the only crime he had committed until murder was a public decency citation because he was walking around naked a bunch. And so in a way, we've lost the ability to dictate what is a threat in civic society in a particular way. And so it's funny, I'm not anti-gun. My dad was in the Air Force. I've grown up in Missouri and now Tennessee. I've been around guns and gun owners a lot in my life. And I kind of agreed with parts of the 2008 Heller decision that people had a kind of right to own guns in their home to protect their home. But there's something about these recent rulings about no limitations. We're just going to arm everybody in public. And there's nothing to be done. And so part of the story of these Trump assassination issues is it was 2 white guys walking with semi-automatic or automatic, in this case, weapons, which made it illegal. But there was nothing to be done because, similar to the book I tell, they really hadn't done anything wrong until in the first case, pulling the trigger. In the second, there was a felony conviction. The person shouldn't have had that kind of gun. But how's anybody going to know that? Because you just look like every other white guy with guns. And so that's kind of why I come down in the book on, regulation is not going to solve this problem. Background checks and red flag laws are not going to solve this problem. Coming to an agreement about what kinds of agreements we need for our public space and how we can invest in those solutions, I think is going to be where we should be going. But these cases are, again, on one hand, terrifying about the stakes of political rhetoric. Obviously, Trump is invoking political violence minute by minute, and then also claiming victimhood by it. It's a vicious cycle. He almost needs to be a victim of these kind of things to prove his point. And so psychiatrists, we call that projective identification. So that's part of the story. But I would also just say that in any other, in another moment in time or another planet or another epoch, we would say, man, this is a warning sign about the breakdown of civic order. And let's think about public safety. But now, again, in Tennessee, pretty much 18-year-old and above can open carry long guns, or that's where we're headed. And there's nothing anybody can do about it.
Your previous book, Dying of Whiteness, as well as parts of this current book, also challenge us to not just think about crime as an urban problem or an urban consideration. You are really getting people to see these are challenges in suburban America, rural areas, and that if we see this as a way more broadly that affects all of us, then maybe we can get some momentum in those ways that change. I'm also curious, Professor, you are unafraid to step into places to talk about your work with people who may seem hostile to this idea or may see this as, listen, this is a person I don't even want to talk to because our views are so diametrically opposed. What do you say to people who disagree and say, look, this is my right. This is my constitutionally protected right. And I don't want to have any conversation about a policy or a plan that people think would undermine that. How do you approach those combos?
How much time do we have left for this conversation? That's a really interesting one, because there are two sides to that. Really, on one hand, I don't know. I grew up Jewish in Missouri. Like, I've been in spaces my whole life I'm an insider outsider. That's kind of how I grew up. I look like everybody else, but I'm not totally on the inside, that kind of thing. It's kind of how I learned to navigate. My dad's a Holocaust survivor. I grew up learning how to fit between spaces, how to talk to people. It feels comfortable to me. I don't assume that people are going to be my enemy. I don't assume, like, if you learn on social media that somebody has a view, you just have this one little clip that you judge them by, and we're all trained to dismantle them or dismiss them or block them. But in the real world, people are complicated, and we might disagree about this one thing, but hey, we like the same sports teams. Or, I have tons of friends who are across the political divide that I know from sports or from growing up in a red state or things like that. And so, in a way, part of the story, and obviously people who don't agree with me aren't going to talk to me. I always am very transparent about what I'm doing. I always am transparent. I tell them to, look me up and talk to me. If people don't want to talk to me, which is maybe a selection, then, that of course is their total right. But I'm always surprised that if I go in with curiosity, how much those kind of assumptions that I have break down. So part of that is about my work leading me into different kinds of conversations with different kinds of people. And that's true in my media life. I've been on Fox News. I've done ministry television, because I think that's kind of where you challenge your assumptions. And that's true across the board. My previous book, Protest Psychosis, I showed up for a talk one time and the organizer didn't believe a white person wrote that book, and I was the greatest compliment of my career. I said, it's just, I just think I can, you have to listen and you have to tell people stories in a way that is true to what they say. But I guess this book was a very particular challenge because this book also critiques common knowledge on the left. But I'm finding that challenging my own camp has led to some really complicated outcomes, which really impacted the process of this book.
The last chapter of the book, before the epilogue, is titled, Where Do We Go From Here? Given that this is a topic that is heavy, that sometimes, I'll say always, feels so bleak and overwhelming, when you think about where we go from here together and collectively, what gives you hope that we can figure out a path to change things?
I hope people feel hope in that chapter, because I really was trying to think about the lessons I had learned. And one of the key lessons I learned, again, I'm not backing away. I support gun laws. I support regulations. I think guns should be a right, the way driving a car is a right, and it's a skill that you should have to demonstrate. And so I support many interventions, but I also recognize in writing the book that it's not like we're going to come to agreement about that. People ask me, like, what can I say to my uncle who's a Trump supporter? And I'm like, just talk about football. It's not like our goal is to change people's minds about these deep identity issues in a way. And that's kind of a trap we get into. But in the last chapter, I kind of out myself as a structuralist. I say there are all these ways in which we can look at the data of improving civic infrastructure. There's all this research that shows that fixing streetlights and building green space and creating jobs programs and sports programs, these things that are used in like South Chicago or South Nashville, quote unquote inner city things. But there's a generalizable lesson there, which is if we build infrastructure that makes people feel neighborly toward each other, and there's a market to that too, because then commerce goes up and property values go up and supermarkets move in and all these kind of things. So in a way, building that infrastructure that makes not just South Chicago, but more broadly in those kind of investments, to me, that's kind of where the answer is. I won't back away from regulation, but I understand that half the country doesn't believe in regulation. But I'm hopeful that we can come together on the investment in feeling safe around the public square, which is so challenged by open carry. It's so challenged. We're taught to fear each other first and ask questions later. And so in a way, that's kind of where I think the intervention should be going forward, is to fix the streetlights symbolically across America and then make that a collaboration between the academy and government and private industry, because it's also profitable in a way. And so I just think that, to me, that's such a better solution than arguing about regulation.
Jonathan Metzl is the Frederick B. Rentschler II Chair of Sociology and Psychiatry. He's a director of the Department of Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University. His latest book is What We've Become, Living and Dying in a Country of Arms. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thanks so much.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Erica McIntosh, and Meg Fitzgerald. This episode was originally produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, and Meg Dalton. Our intern was Frankie DeVivo. Special thanks to Brian Smokler. You can listen to more than 250 previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. Just search for Disrupted and Connecticut Public. And if you love an episode, please remember to leave us a comment. And you can listen for new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown Dean. Thanks for listening.